Hi, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Majandra Rodriguez and I come from Lima, Peru. It's great to be able to share with all of you some thoughts on climate justice, even if it's at a distance. I am a co-founder of Tierra Activa Peru, which was born as Power Shift Peru at the Global Power Shift Conference in 2013 in Turkey. So to answer the first question, which is what is climate justice for youth in South America? Well, I'm not really sure I can generalize the single notion of it, especially now as the term has become so popular and many groups are signing onto it with very different and sometimes even opposing perspectives. But fundamentally, for the climate justice groups that I'm connected to, climate justice is grounded on social justice. That is, we cannot have climate justice if we don't have social justice. And many times, what social justice and what climate justice are is indistinguishable. We say that climate change affects the entire planet, which is true, but we need to be equally, if not more, aware of the fact that climate change impacts certain populations much more than it does others. And it's not a coincidence that populations in the global south, communities living in poverty, indigenous peoples, peasants and farmers, and rural women are among these most impacted populations. It's not a coincidence that those are the same populations that suffer from discrimination, labor exploitation, political invisibility, social marginalization, lack of government support, no media attention, etc. So I think that it's key to understand that climate change increases already existing inequalities. It deepens and broadens the divides that we have already built in our societies through history, through colonization, through economic exploitation, and through the ransacking of the natural resources of the global south. So, in that context, when we talk about climate change, we have to look at how it is connected to other social and environmental issues. We have to see how, for example, indigenous peoples' rights to territorial autonomy is key to the protection of forests in the Amazon, which itself is key to carbon sequestration, which itself is key to reducing the greenhouse gas effect. Another example, we have to see how rural women's access to a safe and steady income and political participation is key to adaptation in rural areas that are most exposed to extreme climate events such as floods, landslides, and storms. Because women in these areas need more freedom of mobility, increased independence, and because their perspectives and needs must be taken into account in local decision making. So sometimes it can be difficult to connect these dots, to highlight what are the social impacts of climate policies and programs. So I think that one key question that we always have to ask ourselves is who does this impact and how? So in an unequal world, we have to recognize that climate impacts will always be differentiated, that some people will always be more affected than others. So we have to constantly ask ourselves who is being impacted and where, what are their perspectives, what are their particular needs and desires, and how can we support them in solidarity and in allyship. So to help us answer these questions, we need to cultivate and expand our understanding by listening to the voices of the most impacted communities. Many of these groups are already organized, have already researched and asked and addressed issues of climate change and climate justice in their communities. And I think that we need to seek them out, and first of all, to listen. I think that these questions on differentiated impacts can help us recognize false solutions to climate change by, for example, allowing us to uncover the private interests behind certain policies through seeing who benefits and who is being negatively affected. So, for example, I was recently in the Peruvian Amazon, and these questions came up. For example, programs such as RED or reducing emissions through deforestation and forest degradation, though they might sound positive in theory, still have some key questions to address regarding who receives the payments that are made for preserving the forest, and regarding indigenous rights to collectively owning the territories, and also indigenous rights to accessing natural resources for subsistent needs, among others. So I guess that's more or less to address the first question. So in terms of the second question, which is actions to act for climate justice, I wanted to mention a couple of key notions that we work off of in Tierra Activa. The first being the notion of systemic crisis and system change, and the second being the concept of intersectionality. So our motto in Tierra Activa is system change, not climate change. And with that phrase, we seek to highlight the fact that the climate crisis is just another expression of a broader system crisis. So, by system, we mean political institutions and how they operate. We mean the economic system and its policies and its priorities. By system, we also mean the social structure or how our societies are organized. This is a system that has generated deep inequalities, where by 2016, Oxfam has found that the world's richest 1% will have more wealth than the other 99%. At the same time, it's a system that has generated ecological devastation and the crossing of 4 of 9 planetary boundaries, according to the Stockholm Resilience Center. The boundaries of climate change, loss of biosphere integrity, land system change, and altered phosphorus and nitrogen cycles due to industrialization, chemical use, and just plain excess production and excess consumption. So, in this context, our actions to act for climate change must be conscious of these root systemic causes. So, we have to subvert what caused this system crisis. So, if the system crisis was caused by excess individualism, excess consumerism, excess industrialization, and excess exploitation of both natural resources and of each other, like the exploitation of human labor as well as the exploitation of nature. So if this is what has caused this broad system crisis, we need to work on the opposite. We need to work on building communities that limit their consumption, that limit their production, that rely on local goods, that increase equality, that rebuild the soil, the lands, and that respect generally our planetary boundaries. So, for example, in Tierra Activa, we last year we organized the national youth gathering, first Tierra Activa or Power Shift Peru, and now we're in the process of organizing decentralized four regional youth gatherings at the end of November, beginning and end of November this year. So these youth gatherings have been camps in semi-rural areas with vegetarian meals, with participatory and community building methodologies in order to come up with work plans in a way that includes the perspectives and voices of the youth present. We've made an effort to reach out to indigenous youth and rural youth for whom it is often difficult and challenging to participate in such spaces. So we've had, it's been a priority for us to be able to fund the transportation of people who might live in areas where you have to travel by boat for a couple days and then by bus and then take a plane, and accessibility in the country varies a lot, and that also runs along the lines of poverty and of marginalization and of impacts. And so we made it a point to host events the most in the most inclusive and open way possible, and to host events that are also very much based on building community. So also with sort of the arts and using culture as ways of communicating and as ways of getting to know each other is important. As well as having a clear system analysis in our reflections and in the discussions that take place, so that the actions that we plan are expressions of what system change is or what it can be, however small. So I think that it's important, to have this system thinking sort of framework to guiding action, so that you can really begin to address the root causes of this ecological crisis that we're facing in a way that can be really meaningful and transformative for people. So that's something, it's ambitious work, but it's necessary work. We try to do it with humbleness and openness and readiness to learn from our mistakes. We're definitely a young group. We're young people. We're learning. But I think that, we have this very strong motivation to really begin to explore what is system change. What does that look like? It sounds so grand and so broad, but really, what can that mean? And we found that at least the last gathering that we had was a really transformative space, on a really even like personal level. You know, it was very motivating to be in a space like that where people could begin to build other ways of relating to each other, even if you had never met before. You know, having those bonds of trust, and sort of this space that was just out in the fields by the river, and being able to have these very frank, open discussions, very unlike, typical conferences where you sit down and you look up, at some person speaking, and then there are 5 minutes for questions and answers at the end, and there's no real exchange. And it's not very open and participatory. So we really tried to subvert that and to do sort of implement an unconference or an anti-conference model, that departed from these conventional structures. And in that, I think that those are small expressions of what system change can actually look like, and that that it is possible. So another key concept, and in which we are in the process of assuming as ours, is the concept of intersectionality, which is a concept that attempts to highlight how all forms of oppression are interconnected. So I, for example, I have a certain gender identity, I have a certain sexuality, I have a certain class identity, I have a certain cultural identity, and other forms of identities. And all of these identities impact, the work that I do, and the privileges and the forms of marginalization that I am granted by the society in which I live. So it's not something that I choose, it's something that, given this society, that is, what is awarded to us. And so I think it's important to recognize this, because these identities shape our perspectives. I'm not going to go into this too much because I know that Ruth and others are also going to go into it later, but I think that it's key and really deeply relevant, to a systemic viewpoint, to recognizing that I'm not just, for example, an environmental activist, but I'm also a woman, I'm also Peruvian, I'm also middle class, and that shapes my perspectives. So in order to make our movements more inclusive, we have to be aware of these differences, not to harp on them or to highlight differences for the sake of highlighting differences, or because we love to talk about how our identities, in a sort of exhibitionist way. But in order to build equity, we have to recognize that we aren't equal to begin with. So at Tierra Activa, we are in the process of designing workshops for youth on these issues with a specific focus on gender and feminism and women's rights and sort of differentiated impacts, of climate change on rural women in particular. So this is something that we're in the process of building. And it's complicated, it's also deeply personal, but I think it's a necessary challenge that we have to face as climate justice movements and as climate justice youth groups, especially, because at least in Peru and other parts that I've been able to visit, you can see how sometimes the more adult groups, or basically more established groups, tend to not highlight these issues as much as young people do. And I think that this is actually really important, and it's sort of a generational shift that we are all a part of, and that can be really meaningful and transformative. Who is present in the room and who isn't, in terms of class, in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality. And even if they are present, whose voices or whose identities are we highlighting, or are we assuming as the norm, and who are we making invisible, and how does that affect our work? I mean, I think it can deeply affect our work as a way of not saying, climate change is the biggest issue and it's much more important than any other issue you can face, because that belittles the struggles of other people who are fighting for housing, who are fighting for health, who are fighting for the right to migrate, the right to escape their countries. It's not about who is more important than the other, which struggle matters more. I think all of them are important and all of them matter, and they're all about our lives. And so we have to see them as well as being interconnected. We can't talk about climate justice and not talk about race, and not talk about gender, and not talk about migration, you know. It's because reality, real life isn't like that, you know. Real life is interconnected and we're all complex people. I know that my time is pretty much up. To wrap up, I just wanted to say that as people based in Sweden, your solidarity with the global south and with vulnerable populations in your region is key. According to Global Witness, for example, Peru is the fourth most vulnerable, most dangerous country to be an environmental defender. Over 57 of such defenders have been murdered since the year 2002, namely rural and indigenous leaders that are defending or were defending their lands from extractivism, from logging, and from other environmentally destructive activities, often at the hands of foreign companies. So in this context, supporting the causes of groups in the global south as global north climate and environmental activists is fundamental to giving them increased visibility, to giving them increased media, increased political attention, and also for demanding to demand protections for them as first impacted people. I think that this is a key a key issue and a key point in which North-South solidarity can really help and can really lead to positive changes. So this is just one final point that I wanted to make. So I guess if you have any questions, we can have an exchange via Twitter. My Twitter handle is at Majandra, which is Majandraa. That's two R's and two A's at the end. So shoot me any questions that you have and I'll get back to you. Yeah, so I guess have amazing, transformative, impacting, productive days for the rest of PowerShift Sweden. All the best and thank you.